All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Happy 4th of July. Romero, how you feel about this great holiday today?
Feeling good, dealing with all of the fireworks that they set off here in the hood.
Oh man, not just in the hood, I think it's everywhere. And I think it's a national trend. Apparently, for some reason, during quarantine, people have gotten their little hands on those loud, obnoxious fireworks.
You think
So
that's
they've been
a
going out for the past at least couple of weeks, if not more.
well? I lived in Brentwood some time ago, and I don't remember hearing the same type of fireworks that I hear outside. And well, I know because I grew up in LA, so I know that even when we were younger, we were the ones that would set off the piccolo. And you think it's something? It's not across the nation. It's just it seems to be. I don't even know if it's just a thing in Latino neighborhoods where they go to Tijuana and get the illegal fireworks and they bring them over here, and then you hear them like they're loud. They set off the car alarms around here.
Car alarms, yeah, yeah, and it's not a Latino thing because people do it in the East Coast too. That you go to other states like Vermont or Maine, some of the other states that have more lenient policies on the type of fireworks that you can have and sell, and then they drive them and bring them back to the state. So I think it's a phenomenal. People just want to have cool manly man fireworks that set off alarms and wake people up and make people think that a bomb just exploded close to your house.
Do you think that's something though that's unique to the cities, to the hoods, or is it unique to young people?
It's interesting because in some ways it's people who have the means and the ability to get those stronger products. So I think part of it is
A
people
desire
who
to
just
get them
want,
too.
huh?
A desire to get them.
Yeah, because part of it, and this happens, I think, we lived in Whittier for a time being, and there was the people lined up in the streets and have fireworks that they set off with the family, but obviously the fireworks that they buy in the stands that you usually see coming up like seaweed or weeds, and the other side, you're getting close to 4th of July because you start seeing all these fireworks shops coming out in parking lots and things like that. But then people kind of want to one up their neighbors, or they want to be the house or the block with the best fireworks. So I think there's a little bit of keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon where people just want to have really good fireworks that other people can enjoy in their barrio.
But when I lived, we lived about 5 minutes from UCLA because I used to work out in Santa Monica, and I remember that entire area, Santa Monica, Brentwood. I never heard any of that. I didn't hear the individual families or people coming out and using the fireworks. They usually it was more like public displays, so the parks would have it or other public places, but not the same way as you see it here in LA, where every other house they're blasting off the fireworks, and even at 1 or 2 in the morning. Yeah, I think it's definitely
Yeah.
very unique to here in the city in the hood, and yeah, I'm not too sure. I don't know what to make of it. I haven't really thought much about it, but I do recall that when we lived in by UCLA, it wasn't like that.
And it's interesting because I think you're surfacing a little socioeconomical issues because I know that those wealthy areas like Santa Monica and other parts have really nice um, fireworks displays. So part of it is maybe because they do have nice fire displays, people don't feel like they need it, or maybe because the demographics in those communities are such that maybe there are not as many young people, not as many families coming together. There's not a need to have fireworks, or maybe they do it differently. So I think it's an interesting point that you bring up, but it's certainly the case that the majority of LA, the majority of, at least here in East LA, I know that even though they're illegal, people are still getting them and setting them off. To your point, at night,
Yeah, I
very late
mean,
at
I
night.
can tell you why we used to do them when I was younger. When I was in high school, we used to do it because it was fun. It was risky. I
Hmm.
suppose in a way it was blowing off some steam as well.
Yeah.
But again, when I was young, I would have thought that everyone did that. But you don't see that in other neighborhoods. For example, here in LA, it's not uncommon to be driving down the street 3rd of July or 4th of July And sometimes if you get into those small streets, like literally the street is blocked because the kids go out there and in the middle of the street they put the fireworks, the ones that shoot
Hmm.
up, and you can't pass until the firework has fizzled out.
That's true.
Yeah, but you don't see that in other areas. So yeah, there's something there. Even in Brentwood, it was a lot of young people, because well, like young professionals, and it's a ton of apartments, because we were obviously, homes in Brentwood go for like anywhere from 2 to 4 million. So most people over there rent. If you're working in Santa Monica or West LA or any other area around there, and you're young, you're renting. But then there aren't many young kids, so maybe
Hmm.
it's not as attractive, because a lot of the times it is the kids in the age group maybe 10 to 18 that really enjoy that a lot. So maybe it is just an age thing. I don't have enough data about other neighborhoods that are wealthier that have young kids. Maybe you see the same type of stuff.
Yeah, and I think part of it is to entertain the kids, and then if you're an older adult, you probably are going to the beach or to a barbecue to have a good time, drink, and probably may or may not have fireworks there. But yeah, so I think it's interesting as we have this conversation, we kind of see how the different ways of what Fourth of July means and how people celebrate and what it means to different people depending on where they are in life, depending what their race or background is. Because the Fourth of July, it does commemorate the time where the United States declared its independence. But obviously, that was something that was hard won and hard fought, where there was lot of a lot of controversy too, and a lot of contradiction from the U.S. getting its independence and people still having people who were still enslaved and taken advantage of. So it's I think one of the reasons why that July 4th is become such a, in particular in this moment, right? And what's going on as we celebrate history, as we think about founding fathers having slaves, about the Confederacy, about the current moment that we are living, given what happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and now more recently, talking about patriotism. You have Vanessa Guillen, who was, a young Latina soldier who was found dead, and then there's a story about sexual harassment within the armed branches. So yeah, it's an interesting time to be talking about Fourth of July, and can't forget about, I guess, an interesting positive thing, the fact that yesterday Disney released or showed the Hamilton film with Lin-Manuel Miranda, which I think in some ways captures a lot of what's going on in this moment, right? The stories, the narratives, the immigrants who contributed to the freedom, the contradictions with the founding, and the how people are complicated, different, and all those things. So interesting times we live in.
Yeah, and just because you mentioned it, a quick shout out to David Diggs, who, just to put
What
it out
what?
there, Brown graduate, class of 2004. So we happened to overlap. We were suite mates for about 2 years. I ended up uh, becoming really close, a guy from Boston, and I ended up moving into their suite. And David was part of that suite. So, I mean, we kind of knew each other, not very close, but
Hmm.
it was great to see him become successful and start making, especially when he came out in Hamilton. I was really proud that someone like him was able to make it. And I remember at the time, because at the time I had already been following some of his career, because he was already rapping, he was already putting out videos from some of the work that
Hmm.
he was doing out of Oakland. I thought it was pretty good. And I always thought, I should send him a message or something, just say, hey man, how you doing? Just letting you know I saw some of your videos and they're pretty good. But then he blew up after Hamilton, or at least
Hmm.
that's my perception, that after Hamilton, he just skyrocketed. So then I thought, oh, man, if I send them a message now, it's just going to feel like, it's not going to feel authentic. So maybe I just
Yeah.
won't. At some point, I'll get a chance to run into him and just congratulate him. But definitely really proud of all of his achievements.
Yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, because you realize how difficult it is. And I mean, to think about what he, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and so many other these artists had to do, like the all the practice, all the singing, putting yourself out there. Because I think when you sing, act, it's putting yourself out there, right? And it's difficult to do, so it takes a lot of work. And the thing is, David, he really did a fantastic job And I don't know if you've seen the film or not, but he does a fantastic job as Lafayette and then as Jefferson, and obviously, he that's one of the reasons why he blew up, because he did such an amazing job in performing both of those roles. So,
Oh yeah, definitely. He's super talented. First of all, I remember back at Brown, he's always
mhm.
different in a unique way. But I just because I didn't know him well enough, it was hard to really see if that uniqueness was just him like trying to be different, or if it was something more of an artistic side to him that was being expressed through his sense of fashion, because his sense of
Hmm.
fashion was definitely very unique. So it wasn't really until I started seeing him perform that I realized, okay, that this guy's the real deal. I remember there was a performance at Brown our senior year, and one of our suite mates was actually a rapper, and we all knew this because he had done a few other performances before, and so he invited us to this other performance. I think it was the final one in the year for us, and so we went to support him. It was six of us in the suite, and so we went to support him. Well, excluding the V, because it was just so four of us went. And in the middle of the performance, the V comes out and he's rapping. I was like, "Holy crap!" Like this
Mm.
guy, great stage presence, great flow, great command of the audience. Like he had everything. So I was like, "Oh, okay, this guy's got it. I think he's gonna."
It's the
I
real deal.
yeah, exactly. This guy's a real deal. I wasn't sure if he was gonna pursue something in acting after Brown, but I figured, if he pursues it, I think eventually he might get a chance to be successful. So again, it's good to see that he did find his break with this play, and I know he released a movie as well. Is it called Blind Spotting? I believe it's called, with one of his childhood friends. I think this guy's name is Raphael, because I know him because I've
Mm.
actually seen him in some of his music videos, and the guy raps as well. So they
Oh
made
yeah.
childhood buddies. So they made this movie together. So yeah, hopefully he keeps on making projects, and hopefully he keeps on getting roles, and just being a good representative of the non-white community.
Well, yeah, and tying it to the 4th of July, actually, he was on one of the news shows yesterday because he is doing, I think he was one of the artists that was involved in the reenactment or the adaptation of the Frederick Douglass famous address, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. So I
Mm-hmm.
believe he is one of the artists who's doing the more modern twist on that famous speech, which again gets to why 4th of July is is a complicated day for many of us.
Yeah, and this is what I wanted to focus on as well. The Try to give some context into what this day represents, not the romanticized, oversimplified meaning that it has now, because now it's enveloped in patriotism, and then the two sentences or paragraph of the Declaration of Independence from Thomas Jefferson, that all men are created equal and so forth, whereas the Declaration of Independence is this huge document mainly of all the grievances against the king of England. But
King
yeah, but
George.
when you start thinking more about all of those grievances, and you start realizing who the grievances were coming from, it was grievances that were coming from very wealthy, privileged men
Mhm.
that were upset that they were paying maybe too much in taxes, that they were losing ships to pirates, that it was affecting their day to day business, their trade. And so those were all the grievances. But now we don't really talk about things like that. We just talk about the symbolism and the
Mhm.
idealism of those words about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But then even within that, there's so much contradiction just based on that reality. So not only Frederick Douglass, but also working non-land owning white people who were also not you have to separate them, because it's a different group, and it also affected them differently. So I have a page here from Howard Zinn, so that we can have a try to put the 4th of July within a context that's more historically accurate, so it's that we don't end up saying something like our founding fathers held these ideals that all of us, because it wasn't like that. It's a group of very wealthy people that wanted to maintained certain privileges and wanted to have independence while at the same time denying others those same freedoms that they were supposedly fighting for.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think of all the things that you mentioned, I mean, you talk about patriotism, consumerism, which, well, consumerism and economics, because like what you were alluding to, it was an economic fight, an economic um, struggle, because then sort of the monopoly that England had on American products meant that the American, whether from the South or from the North, could not get fair market value for their things in other parts in Europe and other parts, and the politics, right? And I think there's a politics, class dynamics, and all of that was at play during this critical time in the nation's history.
Well, here, why don't I just play this one right here? I'll forward it to the part.
From your independence to us, I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy.
There, that's the section that I wanted to get that I wasn't getting from here. Yeah, that's powerful stuff.
Can't imagine what the crowd reaction was, because it sounded like he was sort of I don't think they were expecting that speech from him.
Yeah, I don't know what the hell they were expecting, right? Because this is 1852. What were they expecting him to say? Do you think it was the same type of mentality that goes on today that says, hey, things are better because, look, you're in a better place. So can you come up here and tell everybody else how a lot of our problems are now solved because you, one black person, is doing better than all others, whereas 100 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to be in this position?
I think so, and I think then he flipped it on them and went with this obviously very well thought out, heartfelt rebuttal of that, and sort of explained it like, oh, you think I should be grateful for this? Well, let me tell you this, and which is interesting because I know one of the controversial moments for Michelle Obama was when she said that she finally felt proud of her country, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think people who don't understand why she may not feel part of the U.S. may not necessarily understand where Frederick Douglass was coming from as well. But to your point, I think that they weren't expecting that being called out, or that the holiday, that time where people, everybody's supposed to be called out, I mean, coming together to celebrate as one, you would sort of point the hypocrisy and the shortcomings.
Yeah, and let me just pulling up the wiki page here because earlier you mentioned so July 5, 1852, Corinthian Hall, Rochester, New York, addressing the Rochester's Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. And this is why even today, right? That's why I always seem to have this mixed feeling when 4th of July comes around. Not necessarily because I'm not proud of this country. I know I criticized it a lot, and I was thinking of how to convey in a way my criticism that doesn't make it seem like if I'm just anti-US, because I'm not. Because I always tell people that having grown up in Mexico, I understand the huge differences and how it's just so much better being here. But at the same time, I think it's important to criticize your country because however great it is or whatever good there is in it, you want to also preserve that for the next generation. So it's important to criticize it if you see it being chipped away at. And not only that, it's important to acknowledge that while there are a lot of things that are great about this country, they do come at the expense of others because of the imperial nature of this country. So it's for me, it's knowing what I know about world history, about the U.S. interventionist policy that it's had in Latin America and currently in the Middle East. It's hard for me to celebrate Independence Day and have this blind patriotism without considering how this country is also doing those acts of violence and even terror to other countries.
That's interesting. And I know David Diggs actually mentioned a quote by James Baldwin when I saw that segment where he says, "I love America more than any other country in the world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because you're supposed to. It's the same thing with people, right? If you care about someone, then you're going to offer them feedback, even criticism, if you think that there's areas where they can improve, and it may not always be received in the right way, and that you might maybe even offend someone, or it might be taken the wrong way. But I think if you're doing it with the right intentions, then that's what you're supposed to do. If you care about someone, you're supposed to try to help them improve as a person. Same thing with this country. You're supposed to be able to criticize it.
Particularly those of us who are immigrants or of immigrant ancestry, or maybe from those, it is a complicated thing because it like does, as you were saying, we're both the liberator and the oppressor, and that both and domestically and externally, right? So it's there's a reason for why you feel like you're not, like, why there's that dissonance within you about how to feel and what to think.
Yeah, and I also want to provide some context into what was leading up to the revolution, some of the different dynamics that were being played out. Because again, the divisions that exist in this country have always been across income status, and so it's always really been more about those that are wealthy, landowners that have the power. And you can draw a straight line from the Declaration of Independence all the way to here, and you see some of the same struggles playing out. So I think it's important this to I'm going to read some of these paragraphs from The Spirit of Rebellion. This is Howard Zinn, howardzinn.org. And by the way, Howard Zinn, The People's History of the United States. So this right here talks about, I think he wrote this in, what year was this? 1975. And so he was talking about some of the things that were going on at the time, the Spirit of Rebellion. But he has some really interesting bits of information here. So I'll read just a section here. The Declaration, adopted 199 years ago, says, although those in high office don't like to be reminded, that government is not sacred, that it is set up to give people an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that if it fails to do this, we have a right to alter or abolish it. The Declaration of Independence became an embarrassment to the Founding Fathers almost immediately. Some of George Washington's soldiers resented the rich in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia profiting from the war. When the Continental Congress in 1781 voted half pay for life to officers of the Revolution and nothing for enlisted men, there was mutiny in the New Jersey and Pennsylvania lines. Washington ordered 2 young mutineers shot as an example. The shovelfuls of earth covering their bodies also smudged the words of the Declaration, 5 years old and already ignored that all men are created equal. And then he talks here about slaves. Enslaved blacks in Boston took those words seriously too, and during the Revolution petitioned the Massachusetts General Court for their freedom, but the Revolution was not fought for them. It did not seem to be fought for the poor white farmers either, who, after serving in the war, now face high taxes and seizure of homes and livestock for non-payment. In western Massachusetts, they organized, blocking the doors of courthouses to prevent foreclosures. This was Shays' Rebellion. The militia finally routed them, and the Founding Fathers hurried to Philadelphia to write the Constitution to set up a government where such rebellions could be controlled. And I'll just read this last paragraph here. Arguing for the Constitution, James Madison said it would hold back a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project. The Constitution took the steering phrase of the Declaration, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and changed it to life, liberty, and property. The Declaration was only a historic document. The Constitution became the law of the land. So the reason why I point this out is just because I think it's important to understand that this Declaration of Independence back then, when it was written, it literally was to protect the interest of those that were already pretty privileged. There was already, that's not to say that there wasn't already a spirit of revolution within the colonies coming from the people. Mm-hmm. But that was also because, not necessarily because of the oppression of the king. It was because of the way that the society was being structured, where it was already super wealthy plantation owners, those that had access to all of the resources, and then everybody else, a lot of them lived in poverty, and they didn't have rights to vote if they didn't have property. So the brilliance of all these men is that they were able to channel all of that rage against the British and make it seem like they used the language of populism. Like, that's why the Declaration of Independence uses the language of populism to be able to inspire the working class to rise up, but not at them, not at the wealthy in the colonies, but at the king, and pretend like it was England that was the reason for all of their problems. Because you can mm-hmm. see here that immediately after the revolution was won, and a few years afterwards, nothing really changed for a lot of people. Like, if you were poor, if you didn't have any land, then not much changed for you. You change from an oppressor to another oppressing group.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I think I also read this book called the 55 Men, the Story of the Constitution, based on some notes by James Madison that was done by Fred Rodell. And it talks about, really some of the dynamics that you would thinking about. I think it was really a lot of why the Constitution was done is to kind of try to fight some of the majority rule that was starting to creep up in states, and people not wanting to pay debts and trying to tackle some of the inequality that was happening at the time. And one of the passages says, the South fought not for state rights, but for assurance that it would not lose its slaves. The North fought for protection of the manufacturing interest against the fast-growing agricultural sections to the South and the West. So yeah, it was all about retaining and expanding, protecting their properties, businesses, all that prestige and status that you mentioned.
Yeah, and by the way, this other one here, as I'm looking at it says both documents were written by whites. Many of these were slaveholders, which we know. All were men. Women gathered in 1848 Seneca Falls, New York, and adopted their own declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Because that's one mm-hmm. of the things that even to this day, it's not it's not even mentioned very much, the just the sexist nature of that statement that all men are created equal. You think that by now somebody would have said something about that. It's like, hey, maybe we should change that because
Well, they have. I mean, they've been trying to introduce, I think it's the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, I don't know if it changes that statement, but I think it would give women equal rights as a constitutional amendment. And I think it recently has been resurrected because there was a state that finally passed it, which gave it a number, but obviously it's been so long since the amendment was originally considered that it's actually being um, the court is going to decide on whether or not I think it was the Equal Rights Act actually that is called.
yeah. And by the way, for people that want to read beyond what they may have learned in high school history or from Wikipedia, because that's not all the history that people's history of the United States. It's a great account of a more well-rounded history about the truth about class struggle and power, and that doesn't sugarcoat it, that doesn't paint the founding fathers as these like heroes and ideal men. They were seriously flawed. They were mainly fighting for their rights, and they were still oppressing a ton of people, and not just women and slaves, like even a lot of white people. And if you just see the history of the United States all the way to here, a lot of it has been that class struggle. And it's so interesting that you still see that, because the way our politics are structured, you need to be a millionaire to really have influence, to have a voice. I mean, Obama was, you could say that Obama was like an outsider, but then look at all the backing that he got. Look at all of the, like, he couldn't have risen without the backing of those that are in power. If you don't get that backing, then you can't really go anywhere. So we're still stuck in a situation where it's the super wealthy that are in control, and they don't want to give too much power to the population. They'll adopt the language of populism whenever they want whenever they want to achieve a certain goal, or whenever they want to divert the nation to a certain place, or even these days because of the media, they'll use a lot of manipulation. But at the end of the day, it's still a class struggle. And it's important to point that out, because it helps you start looking beyond the differences within races, within groups, between immigrants, whites, blacks. Because even back then, it was always about. I mean, obviously there were issues, but at the heart of it, it's a class struggle.
That's true. And I think the middle class, and I think the dream of the American dream, so much of it is based on upward mobility and saying, okay, if I can't make it myself, at least my kids will have a better shot at having the type of life that I didn't have. And when you don't have, and when you see sort of the attempts to cut those ranks of opportunity, whether it's by curtailing access to voting, to education, to healthcare, I think that those are all sort of put in place as a way to try to, make sure that the resources stay what they are and they don't go too far away. So I think that unfortunately it is a lot about the haves and the have-nots. So I think that that will continue to be something that we and other societies need to deal with, because inequality is, I think, what leads to a lot of frustration, which is what we're experiencing at this particular moment in time.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it reminded me of the story that I heard about Benjamin Franklin's sister. And because Benjamin Franklin he's the one that started to popularize that notion, that the American story about picking yourself up by your bootstrap, and that in this country, if you work hard enough, no matter where you come from, that you will make it to the top. Because that's the story that especially conservatives like to tell working class people as a way to say, if you're poor, it's your fault. Because anybody in this country that has a drive, it's going to be able to be successful. And so what's often a forgotten story is her sister, I believe, no matter how hard she tried, she ended up penniless and she ended up destitute, because it's virtually impossible to get ahead if you have specific hardships in society.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, here's Benjamin Franklin, who's supposed to embody that, but then his sister, nobody ever talks about his sister, that directly contradicts that myth.
Well, yeah, well, that's something that came up as we watched, because we watched the Hamilton film yesterday, and then I was watching some of the history, and I think that's one of the observations that came up. We don't talk about the founding mothers. We don't talk about the role that the women, the wives, and others played in our independence movement. So I think that you see when this is where a lot of that stuff that the stories being told by white men, and the story of women, of people of color, of underrepresented poor people is not being told. And it's sad because you don't have important voices and important circumstances that inform what was going on at the time. That informs the history, right? So it's a rich, complicated history that it takes some digging to get to.
Yeah, this isn't. I haven't written this article before, so I don't know if I'll be able to find exactly. It was a podcast that I listened to, and it may have been on Radiolab, because I really enjoy that podcast when there talks about that, about upward mobility, because they're debunking the whole myth of upward mobility. And this one's talking about Jane, Benjamin Franklin's sister. It says, Jane was more literate than most women of her stature. She herself was poor in trade, relying on a husband who was increasingly in debt. But she had two brothers who were printers and who printed some of the most popular tracts and journals in the colonies. So yeah, I won't go much more into it, but I do recall from that podcast that the sister is a perfect example of that shatters that myth of the American upward mobility. Hardly they ever talk about her, especially considering that she's Benjamin Franklin's sister. All right. So do you have any fireworks ready?
No, I haven't bought or intend to purchase fireworks, but I'm sure that my neighbors will continue to blast them as they have for the past 3 weeks or so. So I'm sure we're going to see some display of fireworks here in the neighborhood.
Yeah, there'll be some around here as well. I've been hearing them. Luckily, I haven't heard them much right now, but later on, I'm just going to start hearing them.
Yeah, and when you start hearing them during the day, it's like, what? Why are they blowing them during the day? That makes no sense.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to us. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to follow us on Instagram at Brown Perspective, so
Brown
you can
Perspective.
connect with us and follow what we're saying, what we're doing, what we're thinking.
All right. Nos vemos.
Ciao.